Hello, my name is Grigory Lutsenko and I'm the head of AML Department at Coredo. Today we are going to discuss with you what identification is, when it should be carried out, what methods of identification there are, and how to conduct it in the Czech Republic, and what will be for violation of identification requirements. Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell not to miss new videos. As usual, we will start with a term. In our AML direction, there is no term identification, as this term is commonly used and nowhere it describes what it is, but the law describes the requirements how to carry it out. Therefore, let's turn to Wikipedia. Very informative. In fact, identification means establishing identity by information in documents. That is, we need to collect identification data and verify it with a document. It should be noted that the measures used for identification may vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. For example, in the Czech Republic, in addition to identification, it is also necessary to check if the client is on the sanctions list and to check his PEP status. It is possible to recognize the standard condition for customer identification that are found in most jurisdictions. It is the carrying out of an occasional transaction or entering into a business relationship. And let's break down these two concepts. A business relationship is a type of relationship, transaction, or service provider that involves a continuing or repeated relationship. Therefore, relationship without these attributes is an occasional transaction. Also, the concept of transaction can be applied either to transactions or services within a business relationship or within an occasional transaction. Local laws provide more precise definition of these terms, so always refer to the definition in the law. Let's give an example. If you go to a currency exchange office and you want to exchange dollars to euros on a one-off basis, this would be an occasional transaction. But if you opened a bank account or registered an account on a crypto exchange, it is already a business relationship. These were two primary conditions for identification. The other conditions for identification will depend on the law on the particular jurisdiction, as well as the type of obligated person or the service provided. It is very important to study in detail the conditions under which identification is required. Thus, in the Czech Republic, the conditions for identification are described in paragraph 7 of the AML Act. Let's break down its main points. Point 1. The value of the transaction outside the business relationship exceeds 1,000 euros. Point 2. When suspicious activity is detected, or when establishing a business relationship, or when buying or receiving work of arts, object of cultural value, used goods or goods without proof of purchase for the purpose of selling them or receiving them. And point 4. When conducting transaction under conditions not described in point 2 and with a value above the limit set by the company, which cannot be higher than 1,000 euros. If you are an obligated person under the AML law, you need to design your identification process so that these identification conditions are enforced and controlled. Two key factors are required to perform identification. They are identification data and identity document. Let's start with the first one. Identification data is information about nature or legal person. We can say that the minimal list is as follows. For a natural person, it is first name and last name and date of birth. For a legal entity, it is name, date of registration and registration number. as well as address of the registration. The full list of identification data is established by local legislation, and therefore the list may be different in each country. So, in the Czech Republic, the identifying data are for an individual all names, national identification number, so-called rodní číslo, date of birth, gender, place of birth, address of permanent or other place of residence, citizenship of the client, and it is advisable to know all of them, and the data of the identity document, type and number of the document, the state or authority that issued the document, and the period of validity of the document. And when it comes to individual entrepreneur, additional data applies. Full trade name, registration address and identification number. For a legal entity, full name, registration address, identification number, and data to identify and verify the identity of the member of the statutory body. The situation with the last point is interesting because it does not use the term identification data from paragraph 5 of the AML Act, but use data for identifying and verifying. This term is not mandated in the AML law, and it is possible to understand what is meant in different ways. From my practice, I can say that in order to minimize any problems with the regulator, this term should be understood as identification data. Also, paragraph 5 mentions that identification data may not be limited to this, and you can request additional information, such as phone number, email, occupation, or employer details. And before we go on, we need to talk at second most important component of identification, the identity document. This is usually understood as a document that is issued by public authority and contains the following information: first name and other names, date of birth and other data such as gender, place of birth of residential address, and has a photograph. These criteria include documents such as passport, ID card, driver license, and other documents falling under these criteria. If the document does not have any of these data, it cannot be used for identification. For example, the document is used by a private person, for example, a company employee ID card, or the document is used by a state authority, but document is without a photo. It can be a hunting license or some kind of permit, for example, for temporary residence. And you may face a situation when some documents may lack some identification data. For example, passports usually do not contain the address of residence, or the state does not obligate its citizens to register their place of residence. In this situation, you can request document confirming the address. This can be a document that has name and address. Most often requested a utility bill, it can be also bill for cable internet, and bank statement if it has your name and address. Finally, let's move on the methods of identification. It should be said in advance that you should first all be guided by the law of your jurisdiction, as each law explains the methods of identification and the requirements for them differently. In order to perform face-to-face identification, you need two components: the physical presence of a person and his identification document. You need to obtain, verify, and record the identification data and compare with the person appearance with the image in the photo in the document. Let's imagine a situation where we need to identify a person. For this, we need to ask for identification details. We can do this verbally or by using a QIC questionnaire, but the using of QIC questionnaire is more suggestive. And if we see the same information in the document, everything is fine. But if the information differs from the client has told you, for example, the document says John Johnson, it could mean the person is impersonating another person. So we get the identification information and compare it to the document. Then we make a record of the identification. For this purpose, it is necessary to indicate when and by whom the identification was carried out and record the identification data as well as make a copy of the identification document. By the way, you can collect information about the client before identification. For example, to receive from the client a completed questionnaire and document by email. However, the key conditions for such identification is the personal presence of the person and comparison of his appearance with the photo in the document. If we need to identify a legal entity, it is necessary to collect the identification data of the legal entity and to identify the individual acting on behalf of the legal entity, as well as the legal basis of his actions. The legal basis is the position of the person, meaning a member of the board of directors or power of attorney that allow this individual to act on behalf of the legal entity. With regard to identification in the Czech Republic, face-to-face identification is described in the paragraph 8 of the AML Law. Electronic identification refers to identification that is carried out with the help of software. It can include different methods of identification. These include video identification, facial recognition, electronic signature, eIDAS technology, non-doc identification, and other identification technologies. However, be very careful when choosing this method of identification. Each jurisdiction has its own legal requirements for these methods of identification. So, in one country some methods of identification will be legal and in another will not. It is important to completely research the law of your jurisdiction. The Czech Republic is a good example. In the Czech Republic, electronic identification is regulated by paragraph 8a of the AML Act, which established two possible methods of identification, eIDAS and BankID. That's it. No identification providers like SumSub, OnData, OnFido or any other provider. None of this is in accordance with the law. The situation is different in other countries. For example, in neighboring Slovakia, video identification is allowed and these methods of identification is regulated by paragraph 10 of the Slovak AML law. It is also possible to use such identification in Estonia, Austria and Germany. If you will use this method of identification, you should carefully study the requirements for it, which are described not only the AML law but also in other laws and well as the regulators' materials. This applies to any jurisdiction. But go back to the eIDAS and BankID. eIDAS is a European electronic identification system based on the European regulation. This system is used for identify individuals, citizens and residents of the European Union, allow them to use online government services and portals, and it can be used for identification purposes. Moreover, this type of identification is equal to face-to-face identification in terms of reliability. It is a comfortable way of identification, and as statistics show, widespread, about 50% of citizens of the European Union already use this system, not only to use government portal, but also for commercial purposes. However, these methods of identification narrow down the potential list of clients. This system can be used by residents of the European Union. And in order to use these methods of identification, you need to find a provider that provides such services. In the Czech Republic, the provider must be accredited by the Czech Digital and Information Agency. This is a public service that deals with the development of information technologies in various fields. To summarize, again, eIDAS is a trusted method of identification. It can be used by citizens and residents of the European Union. In the Czech Republic, the provider must be accredited by the Czech Digital and Information Agency. BankID, this is a Czech electronic identification system. This system is used only in the Czech Republic and only Czech residents can use it. It is based on the ability of banks to conduct electronic identification. This system is a Czech analog of the eIDAS and is used in the General Electronic Identity System of the Czech Republic. In order to use this identification system, you need to contact Czech banks that provide such services. By the way, identification by means of electronic signature is regulated by a different paragraph, namely paragraph 11.8 of the AML Law. There are two conditions for such identification. The electronic signature must have a qualified level of the protection, and the identification data obtained with the electronic signature must be confirmed with the electronic signature provider. And there is one more way of identification in case you do not suit the methods listed above. This is the method of identification via payment. It is carried out very simply. You receive by any ways of identification data about the client and his documents. Then you need to get a confirmation from the client about the existence of a payment account, usually in a credit institution, and the client must make a payment from this account. More detailed conditions are set by law, as well as the possibility of using this method of identification. Different jurisdictions might have different requirements for this type of identification. More detailed conditions are established by law, as well as the possibility of using this type of identification. Different jurisdictions may have different requirements for this type of identification. Let's look at the Czech Republic. So, the law regulates this method of identification by paragraph 11.7 of the AML Act. 1. The client must provide 2 identity documents. 2. It is necessary to conclude a contract with the client in text form. 3. The client must prove in a reliable manner the existence of the account at the credit institution that is not located in a high-risk third country. 4. The customer must provide information about the purpose of the payment, the name of the recipient, and the sender in the purpose of the payment. 5. This payment may not be used in occasional transaction or business relationship. 6. The payment can be for any amount. These were the main conditions of identification by payment. You should carefully check yourself with all nuances before using these methods of identification. Let's look at the less popular ways of identification. This method of identification in which a person applies to a notary who makes a special document. Let's call it a protocol of identification. This document is drawn up in accordance with the requirements of the law, and it must be received from the client, or it can be sent electronically by the notary. In the Czech Republic, this method of identification is regulated by the 10th paragraph of the AML Act. Transfer of identification consists of the transfer of identities and documents from one obligated person to another. Different jurisdictions have different requirements for such identification. In the Czech Republic, this method is regulated by paragraph 11. However, be careful, not all types of obligated person can transfer identification data. In addition, it does not exempt you from the other AML measures such as customer due diligence or PEP and sanction checks. Two main types of mistakes in conducting identification can be highlighted. Type 1 is a badly developed identification process. This includes non-compliance of the identification process with legal requirements, as well as non-compliance of the actual identification process with the description in the policy. In this case, the conditions of identification, methods of identification, and other actions related to identification, such as recording of information, may be violated. Here are some examples. In your internal policies, you have indicated that you conduct identification in a manner that does not comply with legal requirements. For example, you conduct video identification in the Czech Republic, or you conduct electronic identification but not at the qualified level of authentication. Or you have described several ways of identification in your internal policies, but some of them do not fit your business model or are not used at all. As an example, you position yourself as online platform and you do not expect to meet the customer in their office according to your business model, but you have a description of face-to-face identification. Type 2. Violation of identification process. This happens in situation when employees for some reason do not carry out the identification process in accordance with the developed processes. This may be due to insufficient training of employees, which means they make mistakes, insufficient control of the process, or it may be a deliberate action of the company's employees. Each jurisdiction has its own penalties to impose on obligated persons. The most common are fines or prohibition to conduct activities. In the Czech Republic, the liability for violations of identification requirements is specified in paragraph 44 of the AML Law. There we can see the following. Violation of the obligation to identify the customer is punishable by a fine up to 10 million crown. If the breach was willful, repeated or systematic, the amount of the fine may be reached twice the amount of the unlawfully obtained profit, or up to 130 million crown, whichever is higher. If the offender is a financial institution, a fine of 10% of the company's net turnover may also be imposed, whichever amount is higher. Let's take a few examples of how different companies in the Czech Republic have been held liable for violating identification requirements. Let's look at the fines imposed by the FAO over the last 5 years. We will look at banks and financial institutions, as well as persons outside the financial sector. Let's start with the banks. If you think that the biggest Czech banks do not make mistakes in developing internal processes and the systems, because they work with the best specialists and they spend a lot of money on it, you will find that despite spending a lot of money and working with the best specialists, they also receive regular fees. However, in their case, they have long since perfected their identification process, usually face-to-face and eIDAS, and they have not been fined by the FAO in this area for a long time, more than 5 years. Next, let's look at financial institutions. Since 2021, only 2 financial institutions have been fined by the FAO for violation of identification requirements. One received a fine of 300,000 crowns and other 2 million crowns. There are also 3 cryptocurrency companies fined for violating the rules of identification, where the amount of fines range from 10,000 to 100,000 crowns. Exchanges were also fined. A total of 10 fines were issued for violation on the rules of identification. The amount of fines range from 5,000 crowns to 1 million crowns. Real estate companies were fined amount ranging from 100,000 crowns to 700,000 crowns. A total of 4 fines were imposed. Individuals, employees of the companies who had violated the identification rules were also fined. Several fines ranging from 5,000 to 75,000 crowns were imposed. You may come under the regulator's attention in a random way, or you may come under the regulator's attention on the way to investigate suspicious activity, or the regulator may conduct a test purchase. Either way, it's important to get your customer identification process right and to follow up on it. If you still have questions or want to learn more, feel free to leave a comment and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for being with us.